Hello, 大家好，欢迎回到外媒看中国，我是安博然。Hey, you guys, welcome back to Reports on China. As you can see, I'm back in the chat studio. I have a very interesting guest today who's come all the way from the UK, and he's the author of this book, The East is Still Red. We're going to meet him very shortly. Welcome back to Reports on China. I'm Andy Borham here in Shanghai. Let's get reporting. Welcome, you guys. I have across from me Carlos Martinez. Carlos, welcome to the show. It's really good to have you here. We had Carl on last time. I don't know if you saw.
Yeah, I saw it. Great interview. Unfortunately, I don't have as flashy a shirt to offer as Carl. I've just been at a conference, so I'm dressed in conference garb.
Well, at least we know who the one viewer was. Thank you so much. Now, you have quite a list here. It's hard to kind of pin you down. So, co-editor of Friends of Socialist China, author, you wrote this book, which we'll talk about, commentator and political activist. Is there anything else you want to add?
Oh, that feels like enough for now.
Yeah. Well, I read your book. Actually, this gave me a lot of inspiration for my own book, especially the chapter in here on Western media, which I think a lot of people are cottoning on to. I want to read a part really quickly. The Western media is waging a systematic and ferocious propaganda war against China. In the court of Western public opinion, China stands accused of an array of terrifying crimes. And people would have heard all these before. Conducting a genocide against Uyghur Muslims in Xinjiang, wiping out democracy in Hong Kong, militarizing the South China Sea, attempting to impose colonial control over Taiwan, carrying out a land grab in Africa, preventing Tibetans and Inner Mongolians from speaking their languages, and spying on the good peoples of the democratic world, and more. We've seen this so often in Western media, like nearly every portrayal of China kind of carries a lot of these accusations. And I mean, I've been living here for 10 years. I know the reality, but how tough was it to try and show people the reality, especially in your chapter in this book?
I think the sands are shifting a little bit. So the book came out 2 years ago, and it was written over the course of probably 2 or 3 years. So the first chapter in that book might have come out as an article, or in similar content in the form of an article maybe 4 years ago, when the narrative around Xinjiang, for example, that China's perpetrating human rights abuses up to and including genocide against Uyghur Muslims in Xinjiang, was really at its peak. And people genuinely believed that. It was all over social media, it was all over YouTube, it was all over Twitter, it was all over TikTok, et cetera, et cetera. And ordinary teenagers who knew nothing about China, in as much as they knew anything, it was terrible things are happening in Xinjiang. And it was at social media, and it was obviously on the mainstream media as well. And that was echoed at top levels of government in the European Parliament, in the United States Congress, et cetera, et cetera.
In New Zealand.
Right. So that narrative has kind of collapsed, especially over the last 2 years, especially basically since October 7th, 2023, and the start of an actual genocide.
People saw a real genocide.
Because people can see that. And the other thing that they can see, in addition to having, watching a live stream genocide on their mobile phones, they can also see that their governments and their media don't call this a genocide, but they do call what's happening in Xinjiang a genocide, where there's no, live stream bombings, et cetera, et cetera. There's no live stream starvation policy, et cetera, et cetera. So I think that's caused people to really question the mainstream geopolitical narrative in quite a deep way. So they think, okay, these people are lying to us about what's happening in Gaza. Does that mean that they're also lying to us about what's happening in China, or what's happening in Iran, or what's happening in Russia, or between Russia and Ukraine? So it's kind of led to a crisis of legitimacy, I think, for the Western media, for the mainstream media. And as a result of that, I think it's actually easier to put forward a message telling the truth about China.
But 2 or 3 or 2 years ago when you wrote this, definitely not. I always say it was to do with China being locked down for 3 years. People couldn't come and verify for themselves. So the Western media could kind of run away and push any story they wanted to. And also the visa-free policy. So many people are coming to China, visiting especially Xinjiang and posting videos on YouTube and everything like that. So I think, like you said, it's a problem of legitimacy for the Western media. They can't just keep pushing that. But you mentioned this in your book. It's something that they did do, which is kind of harder to prove. They went from saying genocide outright against the Uyghur people to cultural genocide. What is cultural genocide?
Presumably it means trying to eradicate a specific national or ethnic culture such that everyone forms part of one single Han supremacist monoculture, which, anyone who's been to Xinjiang knows that that's utterly absurd. I mean, I've only been to Xinjiang once, and I've only been to Urumqi, which was in 2019. But, as soon as you go there, you notice that the first thing you notice that all the street signs are in both Chinese and Uyghur language. And you see people reading newspapers in the Uyghur language. You see people reading books in the Uyghur language. You see mosques everywhere. I believe Xinjiang's got one of the highest rate of mosques per population.
Yeah, much higher than the US.
Of anywhere in the world. Yeah, far, far higher than the US, far, far higher than Britain or than France. I went with Danny Haifong, who you know, and a few other people. We went freely to Uyghur restaurants where they didn't serve pork and they didn't serve alcohol, et cetera, et cetera. So you hear people speaking Uyghur language, you see people wearing traditional dress, you see people, dancing in the squares and whatnot in their traditional styles, and then you look into it and you see how Uyghur language and Uyghur culture and Uyghur traditions, just like the traditions and culture and language of all the other, dozens of minority ethnicities in this country, are actively promoted, to the point of, being given significant financial support and resources so that we keep them alive. And you realize that it actually compares very favorably with what happens elsewhere in the world. I mean, what does the United States do to protect indigenous cultures? How many people learn to speak Iroquois languages or things like that? Actually, we should be looking to China more or less as a model of how to protect and safeguard and support traditional cultures.
I think it would be lovely if people could actually, in the West specifically, could actually bite the bullet, I guess, and just look to China for some inspiration. But it seems they're too proud to do so. Now, I want to ask you, because you covered a lot in this book, and it talks a lot about socialism and communism and anti-imperialism and all of these terms that I feel like a lot of Westerners don't actually understand very well. So firstly, a big one, what is socialism? Like, how could you make it really simple?
Okay, I think it's easier to start with what is communism.
Okay.
Because...
And are they tied necessarily?
Yeah, I'd say so. Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels, German philosophers who are kind of the originators of scientific socialism, they analyzed the trajectory of society, but moving out of, pre-class society through slavery, through feudalism, through capitalism. And their analysis was that capitalism results in a core contradiction between two social classes, a capitalist class and a working class. The capitalist class is the group of people that owns and deploys money and the means of production. And the working class is the class of people that has no choice than to make their living by working for someone else, and they're kind of alienated from the product of their labor.
Right.
And their analysis was that contradiction ultimately resolves itself in an end to class society, which is communism, right? So it's a society which is free from exploitation, no more exploitation of one human being by another, no differentiation of classes. Human beings collectively own the means of production and work on the basis of free association to produce what society needs. So your systems of production are geared towards not the production of exchange values, not creating money, not creating profit, but towards meeting human need. So that's kind of the vision of a future communism, which basically we've got nowhere near anywhere in human history so far. And it turns out that that's going to be a very long process of many generations, reaching then probably hundreds of years. Socialism is essentially a transitional stage. Post-capitalism, so like as happened in Russia or the Soviet Union from 1917, as happened in China from 1949 or Cuba 1959, where the working class, the oppressed peoples, the working class and its allies, peasantry, intellectuals, etc., seize control of the state and exercise power in the interest, in their own interest, in the interest of the working class, in the interest of oppressed peoples, and work to build the foundations for a future communist society to meet people's immediate interests, so to improve the living conditions of working people, and to use the power of the state, as a armed body, to prevent counter-revolution and to prevent reversion to capitalism, essentially. So socialism is a transitional period, which and China, modern China, describes itself as being still in the primary stage of socialism. So it says, that we're still in a very early stage of our journey towards communism. It's going to take a very long time, generations and generations, but that's the direction, that's the trajectory.
So a lot of people in the West, they would say, communism is not owning private property, having everything taken from you, and socialism is giving other people's hard work, the fruits of their labor to people who haven't worked as hard. How would you dispel that?
Obviously, there's a basic orientation towards justice and fairness, and to the realization of people's basic needs. So, for example, in China just a few years ago, the country completed its poverty alleviation campaign, whereby it eradicated extreme poverty. So that means that for an entire population of 1.4 billion people, and apologies for telling you something you already know, they've got a guarantee of a certain minimum cash income, albeit not very high, and they've got a guaranteed roof over their head, and they've got guaranteed food on the table. If they get sick, they see a doctor. Their children go to school for a minimum of 10 years, compulsory free education, and they've got water piped into their home, and they've got energy piped into the home. So the society's put incredible resources into meeting the basic needs of absolutely everyone. And that's done on the basis of, these are the minimum demands. These are our human rights. And actually that's enshrined in international law, right? That's there in the UN Declaration on Human Rights, that these are basic rights that we want to be met for everyone. So some people might say, well, that's unfair, because what if these people are just lazy? But actually, I guess it's a more humanistic ideology that says everyone deserves to have these rights met. And generally speaking, if people are given the opportunity to contribute to society, they will do so. So the focus has to be on creating the institutions and the structures, an economic system and a political system and a social system that allows people to participate and contribute, and that at the same time meets their basic needs.
Okay, so since about 1979, when reform and opening up really kicked off, and over the past 4 decades, we've seen this amazing growth in China. A lot of people say, China isn't communist or socialist. It's actually a capitalist place. And they've taken that kind of system from the US or the West in general. The West has helped China become what it is today, because China is actually, while it's run by the Communist Party of China, is just capitalist. What would you say to them?
Yeah, well, there's a few elements to that. First thing is, there's a bit of a trope that China from 1949 to 1978, so from the founding of the People's Republic to the initiation of reform and opening up, was a kind of basket case economy, and it was just a dystopian mess. The truth is that in those 3 decades, life expectancy in China increased from around 35 to around 67, right? So average life expectancy increased by more than a year for every year of the PRC's existence in that time. The population doubled, right? So clearly there was something going on that was favorable to people's well-being. Healthcare was extended to the whole of the country for the first time through, initially the Barefoot Doctors program. Education was extended to the whole of the country for the first time. Literacy was pretty negligible in 1949, with maybe 10, 15%.
Yeah.
By the time Mao died, by the time that Deng Xiaoping became paramount leader, literacy was already, 85, 90%. So there was a unbelievable transformation, including the basic foundations of a modern industrial economy. China was still a very poor country, and people didn't live well, and I'm sure there were issues with malnutrition and all the rest of it. However, compared to what was there before the Communist Party took power in 1949, there's no comparison. And so to call that a failure, or to describe it as an economic basket case, is just not really viable. So I think, it's important to make that point. I appreciate it's slightly tangential to what you asked. But I think, in terms of giving an accurate portrayal of China's history, it is really important. Then as for reform and opening up, market mechanisms were introduced. There was an effort to attract foreign capital. There was an effort to integrate into global value chains and to basically take part in the technological revolution that was taking place and that was being led by the United States, and to attract capital, and to learn from the West. Nonetheless, there are a couple of things that make it very different to what happens in an ordinary capitalist country. Firstly, even now today in China, as much economic reform as there's been, as much privatization as there's been, as many billionaires as there are, and as many branches of Starbucks there are here in Shanghai, the economy still works in a profoundly different way to that of Britain or that of New Zealand or that of the United States. If you consider that it's essentially still a publicly owned or publicly regulated and run economy. So state-owned enterprises constitute around half of the overall economy. They're responsible for around half of GDP. Of what they call the commanding heights of the economy, so energy, telecommunications, etc., transport, etc., those things are controlled almost exclusively by state-owned enterprises.
Like oil, the big five.
Exactly. The banks, the four big banks, are all state-owned, which is crucial because that means that the organizations that are making long-term strategic decisions as to where to invest, where resources are going to go, what we want the economy to look like in 5 years' time, 10 years' time, those are managed by the state and they're accountable to the people, exactly. And of course, China continues to have 5-year plans and a vision of what the economy is going to look like in 2035, what the economy is going to look like in 2050. So private capital exists and collectives exist, but they exist within the framework of an overall planned and regulated economy. And the other thing about saying, well, China's just a capitalist country, then we have to answer why other capitalist countries of the developing world haven't achieved what China's achieved. China's literally the only country. The Egyptian theorist Samir Amin referred to China as the only truly emergent country. We talk about emerging economies, we talk about developing economies. China's the country that's actually achieved it. China, by any reasonable measure now, is the world's largest economy. China's the global leader in multiple dimensions of science and technology, AI, telecommunications, electric vehicles, renewable energy, et cetera, and Chinese people live comparatively extremely well. I mean, China's GDP per capita is only around 14,000 US dollars, but per annum. But $13,000 goes quite a long way in China, in a way that it really doesn't in New York City. So. Why is it China that's achieved this where other countries haven't? And the comparison that I often make, and a couple of people often make, and it's a particularly useful one, is India. The reason why it's so useful and so valid is because both countries got their liberation at about the same time. India won its independence in 1947. China won its liberation in 1949. They're both massive Asian countries, currently population 1.4 billion. But and they both started from a very low place, right? But China's economy is now 4 or 5 times the size of India's. Average life expectancy in China is just past 79 years, which is higher even than the US, and is about 7 years higher than India's. In China, the problem of homelessness has essentially been solved, and as we talked about, extreme poverty has been eradicated. Extreme poverty very much hasn't been eradicated in India. There are still hundreds of millions of people in India who don't have, who can't rely, who don't know where the next meal is coming from, or who don't have secure housing, or who live in the village and they might be in intergenerational debt bondage, or they've left the village and they've gone to the city and they're living in peri-urban slums and working in the informal sector in kind of eking out an existence. So why has China achieved what it's achieved and India hasn't? And I don't take any joy in saying that about India. And in many ways, India has achieved remarkable things, considering where it was at in 1947. And my father's Indian. I've got lots of family in India. I've been to India many times. So it's not. I don't want to do India down. Yeah. But the simple fact is that China's made much more remarkable progress. And to answer you can't answer the question of why that is without talking about its socialist system.
You mentioned before the future planning. I think that's a huge part of it, because I feel like liberal democracies, or electoral democracies anyway, they have a hard time with future planning. Now, China, like you mentioned, has the 5-year plans. They have plans till 2035, even 2049, further beyond. Do you think that kind of future planning, because I feel like it just can't really happen in electoral or liberal democracies, do you think that's a fair assessment?
Well, there was certainly a period of time under, liberal democracy and liberal capitalism where remarkable progress was being made, right? Britain was the world leader and the first country to have an industrial revolution. Germany made remarkable progress. Japan made remarkable progress. The United States has made remarkable progress. But I think particularly in recent decades, and most importantly with the 2008 crash, this is a whole system, a whole capitalist system, which is essentially in decline, which is not innovating in the way that it used to, and where living standards are getting worse. I often say to people, I can walk out of my apartment in London, which is the wealthiest city in one of the wealthiest countries in the world. I can go 50 meters and see multiple people living on the street and begging, and that number is going up every year. So inequality is getting worse and poverty is getting worse, and people have kind of become accustomed to the fact that life is getting worse and that their children are probably going to have a lower
for the
condition of life than they did. So it's like, I think liberal democracy and the capitalist system in general has run out of road, and that's happening. Concurrent with that is China's rise. Where you definitely don't get that feeling in China. I've only been coming to China for 6 years. Even I can see that it's getting more prosperous all the time. It's advancing all the time. The infrastructure continues to get better, and in the things that are really important for the future of humanity, that's where China's taken the lead, particularly with respect to advanced infrastructure, renewable energy, and electric vehicles, for example. I think the key is not so much the political system as such. I think that the advanced capitalist countries in general have run out of ideas. They don't have a vision for the future. It doesn't help that they've got obviously a massively bifurcated political system, which is essentially in chaos. But I think the chaos of the political system in the West, and particularly in the United States, and I live in Britain, where the government has a popularity rating of about 15%. It's literally the lowest since they started counting. I think that chaos is a symptom rather than a cause. I think that's a symptom of capitalist decline rather than the cause of capitalist decline.
You mentioned before the poverty alleviation that happened here in China, massive, more than 800 million people. And now China has started kind of sharing some of the tools of prosperity around the world with the Belt and Road Initiative. What a lot of people will say that is debt trap diplomacy. That was a big one. What would you say, though, to people who say that what China is doing around the world with the Belt and Road Initiative is just debt trap diplomacy?
People that accuse China of debt trap diplomacy are almost exclusively
the ones who do
based in the countries that have been imposing debt traps on Africa, Latin America, the Caribbean, the Pacific, West Asia, South Asia, etc., for centuries. Right? Debt trap diplomacy is what we do. And if you look at the history of the IMF and the structural adjustment programs, where countries facing famine have been granted loans on the basis of conditions of privatization of their water system or their education system, et cetera, and then on top of that, been faced with crippling rates of interest. That's a debt trap. And that stands in pretty stark contrast with what China's doing with the Belt and Road. For one thing, China's loan conditions, and this was research done by a UK charity called Debt Justice, which is a very credible and mainstream charity. They worked out that China's rate of interest is typically around half that of the Western-based multilateral lending institutions, and their repayment terms are much more flexible, and China shows much greater flexibility in terms of defaulting and deferral, et cetera. Meanwhile, what's the reality of the Belt and Road? the reality of the Belt and Road and the vision of the Belt and Road and the reason why the countries of the Belt and Road are so keen on it. And by the way, 3/4 of the world's countries, almost exclusively in the global south, are signed up to the Belt and Road Initiative. Why do they like it so much? It's because it's giving them a historic opportunity to break out of underdevelopment, and underdevelopment that has been imposed on them by the colonial powers for centuries. And you know, to a great extent, the wealth, the prosperity, the riches of the colonial powers has been built on the basis of forcing these countries to remain in underdevelopment. Whereas China's view is, we've developed, we think we've learned something important. You know, we have this famous Chinese saying, if you want to get rich, build a road. We think we can share that, and we think that we can also benefit. We think that we can invest and that we can trade on the basis of mutual benefit. So let's build some roads, let's build some airports, let's build some schools, let's build some hospitals, let's build some solar power stations, you know.
Things that help people.
Yeah. Cuba's suffering, you know, a chronic, awful energy crisis and suffering, you know, regular blackouts. And so what's China doing? China is building literally 100 solar power plants in Cuba. You know, unfortunately, they won't come online for a few more years yet, but once they do come online, that solves the problem, right? So that's the sort of thing that China's doing. So to write that off as debt trap diplomacy is, you know, as I say, it's sour grapes.
Definitely. Last question today. In your book, you asked, will China suffer the same fate as the Soviet Union? And in the Western media, we often see people saying China's about to collapse. What's his name? Uncle Gordon? Yes. He's been saying that for 20 years, that China's on the brink of collapse. Is China on the brink of collapse?
Well, it doesn't seem like it. Yeah, as you say, Gordon Chang's been saying that since, did his book come out in 2002,
2001, something like that. 25 years.
Yeah. We're still waiting for this collapse. It doesn't seem to be kind of round the corner. Yeah, and there's been lots of credible studies doing, including by Western academic institutions, including by the Kennedy School of Governance at Harvard University, about the popularity of China's government. I mentioned that Britain's government's got a popularity rating of about 15%. Yeah. China's government's got a popularity rating of about 93%. You know,
and that's from Western,
which is absolutely unbelievable. Yeah. And that's not, you know, that's not Xi Jinping telling you that. that's a mainstream Western academic organization, and that's backed up by a number of other studies, and that information's been kind of consolidated and drawn together by an academic called Jason Hickel. It's really worth looking at his blog and some of the stuff that he's written on Al Jazeera and other places about China's democracy. So China remains incredibly popular, you know, amongst its own population. China's well-being is obviously increasing. You know, the Soviet economy was stagnating from the 1970s. So the last 20 years of the Soviet Union's existence, its, you know, living conditions were not really improving at a time when living conditions were improving in the Western world. So the Soviet Union never really reached the level of advancement that China's reached. And China's still continuing to progress. China's still continuing to advance. And you can see that living conditions continue to get better, and Chinese people retain a great deal of kind of optimism. And there's a real vision for the future. You know, we've got the second centenary goal for 2049 of creating a modern, advanced, democratic, harmonious, and beautiful socialist society. You know, it's a wonderful vision. Yeah. I very much hope that I'm around to witness it. And the other thing is that, you know, China's increasingly becoming popular around the world because China's focusing on things that we wish our governments were focused on. You know, for example, China is by far and away the world's only renewable energy superpower. You know, it's dedicated unbelievable resources to doing that. And as a result of Chinese investment and innovation and economies of scale, the cost of renewable energy, of wind and solar energy, has reduced by about 80% around the world, such that if you're in sub-Saharan Africa now and you're running energy systems in a country where the electricity penetration rate is less than 50%, and you want to build a new power station, it's actually cheaper for you to build on the basis of solar power or wind power than it would be to build on the basis of coal, oil, or gas. So this is a historic shift, and that's almost exclusively down to what China has done. China's very focused on green ecological issues in general. China's very focused on poverty alleviation. China's very focused on peace. It's got a fundamental orientation towards peace and dialogue-based and negotiation-based solution to the conflicts in the world. If you compare the Chinese government's response to the Gaza crisis with Western government's response to the Gaza crisis, which has basically been unqualified, unconditional support to Israel, which is waging a genocide, there is no comparison, right? So China is becoming more attractive as a global power, and people can see that it's, while it's becoming more powerful and it's becoming more central to world affairs, it exercises its power in a judicious way. It's not trying to dominate. It's got no interest in becoming a new imperialist power. It's got no interest in becoming a new hegemon. It's at the core of an emerging multipolarity. It's at the core of BRICS. It's at the core of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. It's working in G77. It's working in G20. It works very closely with the African Union, with ASEAN, with CELAC, etc., etc. So its vision involves all countries having a voice, having a role, enjoying development and sustainable development, and working towards a fundamentally more democratic and peaceful world order.
Carlos Martinez, thank you so much. A really good chat today. Thank you for coming on the show.
Thank you so much, Andy. Great to be with you.
Now, you guys, Carlos is the author of The East is Still Red, which you can get online. I really suggest you grab a copy. And I'd also love to hear your thoughts, so do let me know down below. Who do you want to see on the show? I'll see you all next time. Bye-bye.